All right. Pleased to meet everyone tonight. Thanks for everyone for coming. I'd like to start this evening's practice session community gathering here by setting our intention. So all of these teachings of the perfections, or the so-called paramitas, are the practice of engaged bodhicitta. And bodhicitta is the primary intention. Bodhicitta means the mind of enlightenment, is the primary motivation of practitioners of the Tibetan tradition of Buddhism, or the greater Mahayana Buddhist tradition. And so that intention is the intention to free all beings from suffering and bring them to the state of enlightenment. And so in the present context, we could think of that we are here to gather together, to study and learn together, to discuss these teachings together, so that we might be able to free all beings from suffering and bring them to the state of enlightenment. So let's start with that as our intention. And now let me give you first, as we kind of come around to this topic, a little bit of a recap to kind of get us back to the present topic. And so first, in January, Lama Tsomo gave a talk about bodhicitta in general, so about that intention that I just talked about. And then along with that, when we talk about bodhicitta, we have some different subcategories or different kind of topics surrounding bodhicitta. And so primarily, we do have another topic called relative and ultimate bodhicitta, but all of the practices we're talking about here are kind of subsumed within relative bodhicitta. So ultimate bodhicitta refers more to the mind of the wisdom mind that realizes emptiness. And so that's another kind of topic that we're going to talk about a lot more next month. And all of these other topics of the 5 initial paramitas or perfections are kind of preparations for going into that topic of wisdom, or for a practitioner, they are kind of preliminary or practices or methods for making you ready to develop that kind of wisdom. So within that spectrum of, or within that world of relative bodhicitta, we have bodhicitta in intention and bodhicitta in action. So bodhicitta in intention is just that intention itself, the wish to free all beings from suffering and bring them to the state of enlightenment. Bodhicitta in action is, primarily talked about in terms of the practice of the 6 perfections. So that is, if we have this intention to free beings from suffering, if we have the intention to bring everyone to the state of enlightenment, how are we going to do that? So they give an example in the classical text that right now, we're like a mother who has only one child, and our child has been swept away in the river, and we also don't even have hands. So we are powerless to save, sentient beings. Like we have this intention, and just like a mother who's lost their only child, we really want to save them. We really want to do something that could actually help beings be freed from suffering and get enlightened. But right now, as ordinary people who are overpowered by our own negative emotions and overpowered by our own confusion, we don't have the power to actually do that much in the world in terms of freeing beings from suffering and bringing them to enlightenment. We might be able to help people in a more relativistic sense, like donating some money, providing this and that, providing services for people, but on a more spiritual level, in terms of kind of spiritual liberation, which is the topic here, we don't have much power to do that. So these practices of the 6 perfections are practices which are going to develop our own spiritual progress, they are going to develop our spiritual capacity, our own power, that we would be able to have more of an influence in the world in terms of lessening the suffering of others, sharing wisdom, and so forth. So these 6 perfections, or 6 kind of practices, the first 5 being methods for developing wisdom, and the 6th being wisdom. So those are first the practice of generosity, and then ethical discipline, and then patience, diligence, meditative concentration, which is the topic of tonight, and then wisdom. And so all of these are, they are ordered in a specific way, in that the earlier ones are considered to be easier to practice than the subsequent ones, that the earlier ones also serve as a cause for the development of the subsequent ones, and in terms that the earlier ones are maybe more obvious, or more outer level, or more obvious, whereas the subsequent ones become more subtle in terms of the way you would practice them. So let me give you an example. So compared to ethical discipline, which often is talked about in terms of making some kind of commitments about your own conduct, So I'm going to take a vow or a promise not to kill, not to practice sexual misconduct, which for a monastic would mean complete abstinence. For a layperson, it would mean abstaining from sexual misconduct, like cheating on a partner, rape, all these kinds of, other kind of topics, sexual misconduct. And so it's easier for someone to give someone else a couple dollars or to share a little bit of their time than it is to make a commitment about refraining from certain behaviors, or like take a real kind of pledge or make a real change in their life about their ongoing kind of way that they live their life. So if you make a promise not to steal, not to kill, not to practice sexual misconduct, not to use harsh language and so forth, any of these practices of the 10 virtues, 10 non-virtues, or on a greater level, monastic vows and so forth, it's harder to do any of that, to actually make a commitment and actually follow through with it, than it is to just give someone some money or volunteer your time for a day or something like that. So that's in terms of how it's easier. On terms of how it's more subtle, like an action of giving is something that's quite obvious. Like if I share my time with you, or if I give you some money, there's some obvious transactional thing happening there. If I make a promise not to do something, like the actual promise is a mental state. It's not actually the physical action of doing or not doing something. It's the mental commitment. And with that commitment, then I choose to follow through with that so as not to engage in those kind of behaviors. So it's kind of more subtle. It's actually a personal commitment. It's not an actual outward physical action. Similarly with patience. Patience is even more difficult, because when we talk about patience in terms of the paramitas or the perfections, we're talking about an undisturbed mind, or essentially it is not getting angry. It goes into more of that. If you want to go into the details of that, there are many categories and subcategories and ways of practicing that. But essentially that's what it comes down to, is overcoming your anger. And so it's easier to make a promise not to do something like physical or verbal, like not to lie or cheat or steal or use intoxicants or whatever the case may be, than it is to not get angry. It's much harder to not get angry. It's much easier, whether you follow through with the promise or not, like it's easier to make a promise not to steal than it is to not get angry. So and so on and so forth. All of the paramitas kind of build upon each other in that way, in terms of being more difficult to practice, also being more subtle in terms of how you would go about practicing them and so forth. And then all of those previous perfections also serve kind of as causes for the next ones. So like one thing that we say that makes a perfection, one of there are 4 qualities that I talked about in the first lecture of all of this. And there's a video on YouTube of that. That's kind of the general presentation of the 6 perfections, if you want to follow up with that. But there are 4 main qualities. And one of the essential qualities of something being a paramita is that it kind of acts as a contrary force, or a suppressive force to its opposite. And so that sounds like a bunch of jargony words, but essentially what that means is that for generosity, if you're practicing generosity, that should serve as an antidote to your greediness or your attachment to this is mine, something like that. So if you're giving and that giving isn't doing anything to upend your greed, like you're giving something you don't care about, like it's just some old clothes that you don't care about anymore, that's not really an act of the perfection of generosity, because it doesn't actually counter your greediness or your attachment. So like it's talked about, that there should be some feeling like that you're going up against something, you're challenging yourself when you're practicing this. So in the present context of meditative concentration, then the opposite is distraction. So that is what meditative concentration will bring you to. It will kind of counter distraction by establishing or kind of bringing you into a state of concentrated awareness. So that is kind of the function of what the paramitas will do. And so another kind of contextual layer to this is that not just are these practices, not are they just the actions of engaged bodhicitta, but they should be, and this may sound obvious to you, but it's easy when you're talking about these different layers of practices to lose some of the point. But just to bring things back around, all of these practices are done and should be done with the spirit of bodhicitta, meaning that you are protecting some kind of sense of ethical discipline or acting in generosity with the intention, even though you know that that immediate moment, like that act of generosity is not going to liberate someone from suffering and bring them to enlightenment, you still do that with that as your main intention. So like you're practicing these 6 perfections with the intention that may this action, whatever I'm doing, thought or deed, may that be a cause for the liberation of all beings and, you know, the bringing them to the state of enlightenment. So that is kind of the context upon which any of these practices are being done. So it might sound like, well, generosity is just good for its own sake or something like that, or it's, you know, good for others. And while that is true, and you are doing this with the intention of bodhicitta, the kind of more of the point is to, or equally to the point as it is to help others, it is also the point to overcome your own attachment and greed. And so like with the second point, when you're talking about discipline, as much as it is that when you enact some kind of discipline, you are often taking vows which are kind of making you act in a way which is not going to harm others. As much as that's important, it's just as important or even more important in terms of what this path and the function of the path, that you are actually protecting your kind of energetic or emotional state to make you a better vessel for developing your spirituality in terms of this practice. So just to like, I want to make sure the context is clear, because it might sound like each of these practices are ends in and of themselves, but that's not really the case. They are actually practiced as one more step in the puzzle, or one more piece in the puzzle of your own spiritual development. So yes, they're also good for other people, but that's not really the point. Like all of the Buddha's teachings in this presentation are for the purpose of liberation. So they're not just for helping other people, or not just for avoiding saying something mean to someone, but more to the point that like, or yes, I don't want to understate or to say it's not for others, because it is helpful for others. But I would say that the emphasis is in that, like, for example, with ethical discipline, if you are not practicing with any sense of like ethical restraint, and you're just saying bad things and hard things and mean things and with a harmful intention, yes, that harms others. But the main perspective that's being talked about here is that it's going to prevent you from being able to make any spiritual progress. Does that make sense? So like if you are doing a bunch of harmful things, that's going to create a whole cloud of like stress and paranoia and all these kind of like emotional states within yourself that are going to prevent you from ever gaining a state of meditative concentration and then developing wisdom and so forth. So that's another piece of this. So, you know, in the Way of the Bodhisattva of Shantideva, one of the, you know, really important quotes that people need to remember is that he said that all of the 5 first perfections, the Buddha taught all of those for the purpose of developing wisdom. And so that's, you know, that kind of sums up what I was trying to say there, is that all of those are kind of stepping stones, or they serve a particular cause, which is going to make you a suitable candidate or make your mind stream workable in a way that you could develop wisdom. So they are also, all of these are also helpful for others. Like, for example, if you're generous, it's helpful for others. You might give them some food, some money, some time, a smile. You might share your time when they need a person to talk to, whatever the case may be. That's a generosity. Of course, it's helpful for them. The main point is you overcoming your attachment to me and mine. You know, and so similar, that goes the same with all the other perfections. So discipline is for overcoming your, I don't know, unrestrained behavior, you could say. Patience is for overcoming your anger. Diligence is for overcoming your laziness. Meditative concentration for overcoming your distraction. So all of those things. Wisdom for overcoming your wrong view or your ignorance, you could say. So let's get into, I think that kind of like gets us, I hope, kind of framed things up to the point where we're up to talking about the main topic, which is the perfection of meditative concentration. So meditative concentration as a general term often is referring to calm abiding, or shamatha, which is a meditation which is generally kind of focusing on an object single-pointedly. So a lot of you have learned this. You've learned some shamatha meditation from myself or from Ken Rinpoche or both. And but here we're talking not just about that. We're talking about kind of all meditations. So initially we're going to talk a little bit about meditative stabilization in terms of calm abiding, but also meditations on wisdom, like insight meditation. So once again, I'm going to be talking again from the same text, which I have been following in the past, which is called The Ornament of Precious Liberation. I find it to be, of all the texts that cover the Paramitas, it is still a little bit technical, and it does still have a lot of quotes from the Buddha and a lot of technical quotes from other Indian and Tibetan masters, but compared to some other texts that talk about the Paramitas, it's a little bit more straightforward. So it's, it has a really easy to follow outline, and some of the texts can just be almost confoundingly complicated. So here it talks about the perfection of meditative concentration in 7 main points. And these are like the same points that are in every chapter. So there's the drawbacks of its absence. So what are the faults if you don't have meditative concentration? What are the benefits if you do have it? What is the nature of meditative concentration? What are the different aspects of meditative concentration? What are the characteristics of those different aspects? How you can increase it, how you can make it pure, and the results of that. So you don't have to remember any of that. We're just going to go through. I'm just letting you know, like a common way of Buddhist teachers to teach is by giving you an outline first and then going through each of the outline points. So that may be helpful for some people. It may be annoying for other people. But anyway, just remember that you don't need to remember it. It's just a helpful tool for some people. And it helps to recenter the conversation. Sometimes when we're getting through into a point, I'll come back and I'll say, remember, we're just only talking about the different types. We haven't even talked about what that type is. We're just mentioning the types, that kind of thing. So it's helpful to have an outline. So the drawbacks of the absence and the benefits of the practice says then that, I'm just going to read a little bit from the text. I'm not going to read this whole book to you. I'm just going to read some portions just to give us something to talk about. So someone possessing the qualities of generosity and so forth, but lacking meditative concentration, can be overpowered by distractions, and so will be wounded by the sharp fangs of the afflictions. So this is kind of flowery language that you find in Dharma texts, or metaphorical language. So in the Way of the Bodhisattva, it says, humans whose minds are very distracted live between the fangs of the afflictions. So when they use the word afflictions in Buddhist texts, they mean attachment, aversion, ignorance, jealousy, pride, those kind of things, covetousness, afflictive emotional states or mental states. So when it says generosity, the qualities of generosity and so forth, that's another thing that you'll find a lot in Buddhist texts. When they say generosity and so forth, they mean the 6 perfections. So like if they say starting a list, like for example, they might be talking about the 4 noble truths, and they'll say the truth of suffering and so forth. They mean the four noble truths: the truth of suffering, the causes of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path to the end of suffering. So that's another common thing you'll find in Buddhist texts. So sorry, that was an aside, but it might be helpful when you're reading some books sometimes. If you see something like generosity and so forth, it means generosity, ethical discipline, patience, diligence, meditative concentration, and wisdom. So furthermore, without meditative concentration, the clear cognitions will not arise, and without them, you will not be fully equipped to benefit others. So clear cognitions here is talking about kind of states of clairvoyance. So in Buddhist texts, they say that in the Buddhist tradition, they say that, through the power of meditative concentration, especially shamatha, calm abiding meditation, that you will gain some states of clairvoyance, of being able to read other people's minds and understand their levels in terms of what is necessary. Like every student, every person who comes to the Dharma is coming from a different perspective and from a different kind of place in their mind and in their life, where different kinds of teachings may be more or less appropriate for them. So it's said that like when a Buddha teaches, or when someone who has such states of clairvoyance teaches, they can teach that person precisely what they're ready for and what's going to be the most useful for them. So they're saying if you don't have meditative concentration, you'll never gain that type of insight. That's kind of highfalutin language and some maybe seemingly far off states, but anyway, I believe that those kind of states exist, and I think that definitely could be attained. So this is the main point now. It says, moreover, if you lack meditative concentration, wisdom will not arise. And if wisdom has not arisen, enlightenment will not be attained. And so that's a main point that we talk about all the time. Anytime we talk about meditation of calm abiding, and what's the point of meditative absorption or calm abiding, is always talked about as something which is going to stabilize any further meditations that you would do. And particularly, we're usually talking about vipassana or insight meditation. So the example that we always give, that Ken Rinpoche always gives, is like, let's say you have a candle in the middle of a room, and the room is pitch black except for the candle, but the wind is making that candle flicker. So it can't really illuminate the room very well as long as it's flickering. And as soon as that wind stops stirring, then a single candle can light up an entire room. Another example that he gives a lot is, let's say you're trying to look at something and you're trying to look at it carefully, but you're just blinking constantly. You can't ever get a very good, clear picture of it. And so that's an example that they give of what would happen if you had insight, meaning let's say you had an intellectual understanding of the nature of reality, but you don't have a still or kind of calm mind through the practice of calm abiding or meditative concentration. You would never be able to stabilize that insight to make it powerful enough that it would ever really transform you. And when we say transform you, what that means, they always say that the Buddhist teachings are teachings that liberate through seeing. And so what that means is that we have, according to the Buddhist teachings, we have been in this state of dissatisfaction, suffering, samsara, whatever you want to call it, since time immemorial, you could say. And we're in that state because of a misapprehension of reality, because we don't see what's actually there. And so we're in a state of confusion or delusion. And then the way that we could overturn that is by seeing things as they really are. But a quick little glimpse or an intellectual flash of understanding isn't enough to overcome that which has become a fully ingrained habit. So not just if you take like the past and future lives world of Buddhism seriously, not just in one lifetime, but for countless beginningless lifetimes, we have been fully ingrained and habituated into believing that everything is as we see it in our confusion or delusion. And so just a quick little flash of insight isn't enough to overcome that habit. So Shantideva in the Way of the Bodhisattva, this will come up in the next, the talk about wisdom. He says that when you meditate on and gain a habit of seeing things as if they're not truly existing, then you will overcome the habitual patterns to believing that everything's real. Real and not real, that's technical language, which I'm not going to get into too much right now, but essentially we would say that what is seemingly real only seems real through our delusion. And so when we say not real, we mean that there is some greater or superior kind of reality that we're not normally seeing. But when we see that, to overcome our habitual patterns of thinking that what we see is real, we have to really stabilize that insight with calm abiding or with meditative concentration so that we can abide or remain in that state of insight for a really long period of time in a meditative state, so that we will then be able to, gain a new way of seeing, which will overcome or overwhelm our old habitual pattern of thinking everything's real. Does that make sense? So I know that I left out some of the details because that whole discussion of what is real and not real and wisdom and emptiness and all that is a whole topic in and of itself that will get talked about in the wisdom chapter, or the wisdom, perfection of wisdom topic, which we'll talk about in the next one community. So let me continue on. So that was the faults of not having meditative concentration. And there's a quote that comes up all the time from the Way of the Bodhisattva. I know I'm saying the Way of the Bodhisattva this and that, but it's a text when you're talking about this general path of Mahayana Buddhism, bodhicitta, the six perfections. It's a text that just gets quoted again and again and again and again by every Tibetan teacher. And that's where I got all of my training. And that's also, it's being quoted a lot in the text that I'm following here. So, but it says that understanding that the afflictions are totally vanquished by profound insight, that is vipassana, conjoined with calm abiding, then you should first seek out calm abiding. That's what the quote says. So what that means is that when you know that the only way to actually overcome those afflictive mental states or that belief in a seemingly real reality, when you realize that the only way to overcome that is by having calm abiding or this stabilized mind or concentrated mind joined together with the insight, that's the only way you're going to overcome it. When you know that, then you should first develop that concentrated state. So first you should focus on shamatha meditation or calm abiding meditation. So that's what Shantideva is saying in that text. So then the opposites are, when you go into the benefits, it's basically the opposite. You'll get liberated, you'll attain stability, you'll become a Buddha. Like basically that's what it is. So, that's essentially what it says. If you have it, then you'll have insight into the perfect truth and therefore generate compassion for sentient beings. So there's that. This is another kind of side topic. And I feel like if I keep going on every side topic, I'm not going to get through the main topic, but I think this is an important one. So it says, if you get insight, then you'll have compassion. You'll be able to generate compassion. What does that mean? Because a lot of us do a lot of compassion practices right now, even though we don't actually have insight into the nature of reality. So what does that mean? Ultimately, what that means is that the compassion that we're developing right now is still kind of a fabrication. We're still kind of making it up in our mind. And there is a more purified or more authentic state of compassion that comes about when you have insight into reality. And so it's that whole process that I was just talking about right now, or just now, that when we realize that the reason why we have been suffering is because we've been in this misapprehension of reality. That misapprehension of reality, that ignorance, creates or leads us into afflictive mental states, attachment, aversion, ignorance, jealousy, pride, and so forth. Because of those afflictive mental states, we keep creating situations that perpetuate our experience of suffering. We would call that karma. We're creating karma. And so those are habitual patterns and habitual states, which are basically leading us to continue that process. Then when we understand that this insight or this, realization of the nature of reality, when we see that for ourselves, and we see that that is what overcomes the suffering for us, then we will automatically be able to see that for others as well. And then there's a natural expression of compassion that's no longer just some kind of like thought game. I don't want to like put it down. Like it's really important to develop that kind of like more relativistic, I'm sitting down thinking about the suffering of others and wishing for them to be freed from that suffering. That's an important process, but that is kind of also a stepping stone towards getting to a more authentic experience of that, which comes about through insight into the nature of reality. So I know that was a mouthful, but I hope that made sense. We can talk about it later also. So take a note if that part sounds confusing, and we'll talk about it in the Q&A question or section in the end. So Rachel, how much time do I have? I'm totally just talking and not paying any attention.
You still have about a half hour.
Okay, great. So then further, through being endowed with meditative concentration, you will establish disciples in enlightenment. Basically, you will get enlightened. You'll be able to develop compassion for others in a more authentic way. And then that will also enable you to help others to get enlightened. That's the essential point. So now the nature of meditative concentration, this is like the next main topic point here. And so that is, this is characterized by tranquility, wherein the mind rests on an object of virtue. So basically what that means, the translation in this text is a little awkward, so I'm just going to rephrase it myself. It is a mind which rests or abides single-pointedly in a virtuous object. And so we'll talk in a minute about what that means for it to be a virtuous object. But essentially, it says that this kind of meditative concentration is attained through eliminating its opposing force. That's what I talked about before. All of these paramitas will eliminate their opposing force, which here is distractions. So the first priority then is to overcome distraction. That involves seclusion, insomuch as the body needs to be secluded from worldly pursuits and the mind needs to be secluded from its habitual thought process. So the guide to the way of the Bodhisattva, or the Bodhisattva's way of life, says, with body and mind secluded, distracted thoughts will not arise. So a virtuous object here means that basically that when you're meditating, you shouldn't meditate on something that triggers your emotional responses. So I shouldn't focus on, if I'm trying to meditate and I'm, for example, in a lot of concentration practices, you focus on an actual physical object, like a picture of the Buddha. And then after you get better at that, then you use maybe a mental object, like a visualized object. When you get better at that, you even drop the object and are just kind of being present in a state of awareness. Then from that, you maybe move on to insight meditations, vipassana meditations. So essentially what's being said is you shouldn't use like a picture instead of a Buddha of someone that you're attracted to, or you shouldn't use a picture of some food that you think is really delicious or something like that. Like, sometimes we talk about mindful eating or whatever, and that's fine, but like you shouldn't meditate on a desirous state of mind when you're trying to meditate, because that's actually just reinforcing the afflictive emotion of desire. So that's what it means to be a virtuous object. It means something that is not perpetuating those kind of afflictive emotions. So something that you're focusing on is not actually triggering or causing those emotions to rise up. So then we're talking about seclusion. And a lot of this, in the text is talking in some extreme ways, like for like some monks or nuns or like yogis who are going to throw everything away and run off to the mountains. And luckily I have heard, Ken Rinpoche give a lot of teachings about this to make them, a lot more practical for people who do have a home and a job and children, and they can't just give up everything. And so I'm going to try and share both sides of what it might mean for both of those types of people. So it says with mind and body secluded. So in the beginning, it says, we can talk about how to seclude the body and then how to seclude the mind. And so it's basically talking about distancing yourself from distracting activities, and then what causes those distractions and how those can like harm our pursuit of meditation and so forth. So I'm going to read this literally, and I hope that this isn't off-putting to you, and maybe we can just have a little chuckle. And I'll try and explain the context of it as well. Because to a person who is like, has not read classical Buddhist texts, this is going to sound extreme, okay? Buckle up, Jessica said. Okay, so it says, the nature of distractive activities is to be in a state of distraction due to involvement with children, spouses, acquaintances, and possessions. And so then it says the cause of distracted activities is attachment to those things. So attachment to material goods, food, clothing, and the like, attachment to reputation and respect, to praise, being attached to certain outcomes, all that kind of stuff. So I think that, we can talk about this in a way that isn't like, and I don't think that they even mean it this way, attachment to something and throwing that thing out of your life are two different things. They're not saying you should abandon your children and run off to the mountains. They're not saying abandon your partner and run off to the mountains, but they're saying that excessive attachment to those things or any activity surrounding those things is going to become an obstacle to your practice. So like, for example, I know some people in my life who have a partner or children, and they will not give themselves a single moment in their life of free time. They will not set any boundaries to give themselves any time. And they throw everything that they have, or they feel like it's their responsibility that they have to put every moment of their life and every thought in their mind towards that, towards their family, their children, their career, whatever the case may be. And in that case, you're going to be in a place where, in terms of your body and your mind, you're so caught up in busyness and distraction that you'll never have a single moment to ever develop meditative concentration. So that's the perspective from which this is being talked about. So that could be taken to more or less extreme ends. Like for some people, it will be, okay, I'm never going to have a partner. I'm going to be a full-on yogi and like do retreat all the time. For some people, it's like, okay, maybe I need to set some better boundaries in my life so that I have, an hour or two here or there a few times a week, or like once a year I can go to this retreat, or whatever the case may be. So it is just about, figuring out where these kind of instructions might apply to your own life, and trying to see, that there's also something that I could do for myself in order to free myself, even in a, not ultimately free, but like free myself in terms of like setting up a situation where I can contribute or like put more of my time into these kind of practices, if that's something that I'm trying to prioritize. So I think that's a way that we should think about this. So then, because of attachment and craving to material possessions, the world is not relinquished. This is like talking about, if you're, obsessively attached to material possessions, buying things and craving things and trying to, for example, like they talk about, always trying to increase your wealth. And when you try and increase your wealth, there's the suffering of trying to increase your wealth, then of trying to protect your wealth, and then trying to, increase it even more. And then, that's just another distraction. And that is saying, and he said that the cause of this is the attachment to that, not the thing itself. So what that means is that you can still make investments. you can still have a partner, you can still have a successful relationship, but excessive attachment to those things is going to prevent you from contributing the kind of time that you actually think in your mind you want to contribute. Because I think most of us who get into this kind of spiritual path, we have a real intention, like, I want to meditate, I want to make progress, I want to get enlightened, whatever the case may be. But then we have to kind of actually be realistic and assess, well, am I setting up a situation where I'm going to be able to actually put the time required into this to make some progress? And if not, what is prohibiting that? And how could I maybe set things up better for myself in a skillful and kind way, not just like, so I've also seen this happen, and I'm probably going to like not be able to go through the full presentation of this because I'm going to blab about other things, but I think this is more helpful. I've seen a lot of people, instead of making skillful boundaries in their life around their practice, they push other people away in their life. They push their family members away or their partners. And then they almost act passively aggressively, like to that person, like, oh, you're the reason I'm not able to meditate. And that's actually the problem, is in the meditator. It's not in the relationship with the other person. Just from the very beginning, if it's a priority to you, you need to communicate that clearly and set up a clear boundary in a skillful and kind way, instead of pushing someone away or in a rude way saying, I'm trying to meditate, leave me alone, or whatever. I don't know. I've just seen this a lot. I've done it myself in certain instances, got into a kind of weird relationship with friends and family in terms of like pushing people away, instead of just like setting up like honest and clear boundaries from the beginning. So I think that's a really important point. So then coming back around, the harm of distracting activities. So that is basically just that if you're caught up in all kinds of distraction in terms of you're doing all kinds of things, like you're involved in so many different activities and so many different friends groups and so many different sports and this and that, then you're not ever going to be able to put any time into your practice. And once again, I'm not saying quit everything. I'm just saying that you have to be realistic about, if it is an actual priority to you, then you have to make it a priority and set up some kind of situation where you're going to be able to do that. And in terms of when it said seclusion of body, in this specifically, it is talking a little bit about running off and doing a retreat somewhere. But also we talk about this all the time in terms of setting up, just what I was saying before, like setting some clear boundaries. Like if you're in your house, even if you have a quite small space that you share with other people, just to say, okay, for this half an hour, can you please leave me alone in that room? That's your seclusion of body. But that's your kind of retreat boundary for your half an hour meditation session or whatever. So to set something up like that, a situation which is going to permit you to be alone and really be able to go deeper into the practice, is a way that we can understand that seclusion of body. Not necessarily that we have to go off into a retreat. That's also a great thing. And I would encourage people who have the time or who can make the time to do that as well, to go into deeper retreats and so forth. Like the progress that you can make in a deeper retreat will help, if you're doing a daily practice and your daily practice is slowly getting better and better like this, in a retreat, you might jump like that. And then that's your new baseline that you're building on. So, you can make a lot of progress. So I definitely would encourage people, when the time arises, when the opportunity arises, to do retreats as well. But that's not necessarily, a lot of people, they wait for the retreat and then don't actually put any effort into their day-to-day practice. They're like, oh no, like later I'm going to do a month retreat. I'm going to do a 3-year retreat or whatever. And then they don't actually like pursue their daily practice. And then they just kind of like plateau or stay where they're at and don't really make any progress. So it's really important to set up a situation where you can have a successful daily practice instead of just hoping for some future event where it's going to be better, because it's never going to get better. I mean, it might, but if you're not doing something actively to make it better, anyway, it's not useful to put your hopes in some future situation. So, all right. So then I'm going to jump ahead here to, I'm going to skip past this seclusion stuff because we just talked about it enough to the point that we don't have enough time to get through all the sub points. But they basically say that, if you stay in seclusion away from busyness, that naturally the distractions are not going to influence your mind as much. And when you're not wrapped up in all that stuff, your mind's not getting pulled out into all those objects, you can naturally fall into a meditative state much more easily. So you won't get. And so once again, thinking of meditation or meditative concentration as being the opposite of distraction. If you're not involving yourself in so many different things, or you're not attached to so many different things, then when you try and sit, your mind's not going to be pulled out to all those different distractions, and you'll be able to settle into the meditation better. So that's one thing that a lot of people find when they do longer retreats. When you're in this longer retreat and you're putting away your social media, you're putting away all your normal activities for a week, maybe by day 2 or 3, you really start settling into this state where you're like, oh, I don't have to think about that stuff anymore. I really can just be here. And so on a smaller level, we can do that in our daily practice and through, really taking a time out from phone stuff. I always encourage people, and I probably already said this in the One Community forums too, but I really highly encourage people to not look at your phone first thing in the morning, especially if you're trying to set up a morning meditation practice. Don't look at your phone until after you've gotten up, done your morning routine, meditated, and then finally, when it's time to go into your day, look at your phone, check your email, whatever you need to do. But, looking at that first thing in the morning is already pulling the attention of your mind out into the world, and it's going to prevent you from really getting into your meditation in the morning. So really, really, 21st century biggest distraction of a meditator in the world is the smartphone and the internet. So really, it's like anything that's mentioned in here, I would say the phone is 20 times worse than anything that's mentioned in these classical texts in terms of the level of distraction and like the ruining of someone's meditation practice. I'm speaking from experience and from like a lot of people I know. So, all right. So seclusion, let's move on. Then there is a whole section about like particular antidotes to particular issues, like of the 5, attachment, aversion, ignorance, jealousy, and pride. But it's a really long section that we really don't have time to go into. So I think the main kind of essential point here moving forward is that the first kind of, when we're talking about what is meditative concentration, and I've been emphasizing mostly the calm abiding or the concentrated aspect, which is just focusing on a single point, that is developed through a practice called calm abiding. And so and that's the first of the 2 main kinds of meditative concentration. So that's just, there's no content to the mind. There's no like thought. You're not holding on to a thought, or there's no thought process happening. It's just trying to rest your mind on an object. And then once you have stabilized to a certain extent, then it is to use that stability often in Vipassana, it is an analytic type of meditation. So you think about the nature of reality, you do some kind of investigation of the nature of reality. And then when you come to a kind of a conclusion in your investigation, then you just rest in the state of kind of seeing that conclusion. So like, for example, there's meditations on impermanence or selflessness. So like with impermanence, maybe like with a subtle impermanence meditation, you might think about that I'm 43 years old. And when I was 20, how did I look then? How was my body then? How were my thoughts then? And then up to now, did I just change all at once like that from 20 to 43? Or was that something that was happening slowly? And when you break that down and think about it, you'll come to a realization that you're actually never staying still, and you never are who you are, even in the second instant. You're constantly changing. Your body and mind are constantly changing from instant to instant, instantaneously. So we call that subtle impermanence. So you would do an investigation to kind of think about that kind of process. And when you come to the insight, the like kind of aha moment of seeing that there is no permanence and that everything is constantly changing, then you just rest in a state of single pointed, calm, calm abiding meditation, basically, but it's infused with insight. So that's the union of calm abiding and special insight, or shamatha and vipassana. Then when you get distracted, you refresh. You do the analysis again until you have that freshness of the insight brought back into your mind, and then you rest in that again. And once again, when you're resting, Namcha Khen Rinpoche always emphasizes that you're not holding the thought. Everything's impermanent. You're just trying to see impermanence in your mind's eye. You have that kind of aha moment. That's the insight, and you just try and remain in that state of that insight. So it's not a holding to a thought of everything is impermanent or everything is selfless or something like that. It is just like resting in the state of actually kind of seeing in your mind's eye the truth of that situation. So that kind of covers the essence of the 2 types of meditation, shamatha and vipassana, or purely concentration meditation or insight meditation. So now we'll talk about how the power of meditative concentration can be increased. And so it says it's increased by the 3 powers described above: pristine awareness, wisdom, and dedication. And so it says in this text, it says, as they were explained above, that's talking about that topic was covered extensively in the first of the 6 paramitas, in the perfection of generosity. So a lot of texts will say this kind of stuff too. They'll be like, if this is following a similar outline to the other paramitas, it'll say, it won't give you the explanation again. It'll just say, these are the 3 points, just like before. And just like before means in the first paramita where I explained it extensively. So that's, another tricky thing in some classical Buddhist texts is they refer back instead of explaining the topic again. So when it says that they're increased by the power of pristine awareness, that's talking about the awareness of emptiness. So there's often this thing that they call the emptiness of the 3 spheres. And so the emptiness of the 3 spheres in terms of an act of, I'll talk first as an act of generosity, because that's the easiest one to understand, I think, is that I see the emptiness and therefore lack of inherent or independent existence of me as a giver, as someone else as the recipient of my generosity, and the action of actually giving something. So with meditation, it is that I see the lack of inherent existence of myself as a meditator, something that I'm meditating on, like emptiness or calm abiding or something like that, and the action of meditating. So with that kind of insight into the nature of reality, that increases the power of the meditative concentration, basically is what it's saying. And then wisdom, this is talking about like analytic wisdom, like a discriminating or discerning wisdom, like knowing what to do and what not to do. So in terms of meditation, that could mean knowing that when a distraction comes up, like how to deal with it, instead of just falling into the thought process or something like that. Knowing what is helpful and harmful in terms of setting up my situation for my meditation. All of those things are aspects of wisdom. And then the third is dedication. So dedication is, I probably talked about this before, but at the end of any practice in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, which is the Tibetan Buddhist tradition as part of the Mahayana tradition, we end every practice with a dedication of merit. So we'll say, whatever practice I've been doing, may that become a cause for the enlightenment of all beings. So we kind of give away whatever virtues. We're not trying to hold on like in a kind of spiritual materialistic way of thinking, oh, well, I did this practice and I did that retreat. Instead, it's like, if there was any goodness in this, I give it away to everyone else as a cause for their enlightenment. So that is the third of the kind of things or qualities that would empower or increase the strength of your meditative concentration. And then it says how that this can be made pure. Are we at time, Rachel? Almost. So how it can be made pure, how meditative concentration can be made pure. And it says when it's supported by emptiness and compassion. So what that means, we already talked about how it's made more powerful by emptiness, but this is talking about when it is with emptiness and compassion. It's kind of a branch topic here, but we have this topic in Mahayana Buddhism that we call non-abiding nirvana. So what that means is that some people practice Buddhism as a way to overcome their own suffering without concern for others. And so for that type of person, we say that they fall into a one-sided state of peace, like an extreme, you could say, of peace. And on the other side, if we don't do anything to better ourselves or to further ourselves in a spiritual path, then we fall into the extreme of ordinary existence or of samsaric existence. So if we practice wisdom, then that wisdom will help us to be liberated from ordinary existence. But the power of compassion keeps us from falling into a one-sided, selfish kind of peace or a selfish kind of liberation, which will then continue working for the benefit of others. So that's what it's talking about here when it's saying that it's purifying your practice. It's preventing you from falling into the extreme of a one-sided peace or an ordinary experience of delusion or samsara. So then it says the fruits of meditative concentration. So the fruits of meditative concentration are temporary and ultimate. So in the temporary sense, you can gain a more clear and stable state of mind. You can become more calm, less overpowered by your emotions, that kind of thing. On the ultimate level, you'll get enlightened and you'll be able to help others to do the same. So that's kind of the the essence of meditative concentration. There was a lot more that I didn't go into just because of time constraints and whatever. But I think that, is probably more helpful to emphasize the points that I emphasized rather than throw another list of numbers at you that they're often like the 6 of this and the 4 of those and the 17 of these and whatever. And there were a lot of lists in there that I skipped intentionally. So